Good afternoon. Hello and welcome everyone who's joining us today. We're excited to be back with our new Red Dot Cafe live conversation. My name is Michelle Villagomez and I'm a TEDx San Antonio Programming Committee volunteer. And I'm going to be your host for today's conversation. We want everyone to take part in this, so feel free to leave any comments and questions in the feed. As the chat continues, we'll be monitoring this feed to highlight any questions that we might be able to bring up to our speakers. We're happy to be joined today by Professor Lawrence Lessig. He's the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law and Leadership at Harvard Law School. He actually was also a TEDx speaker back in 2010. And we are also joined today by Drew Galloway. He is the Executive Director of Move Texas. He was also a TEDx speaker in 2017. In 2010, Professor Lessig was able to shed some light on some of the campaign cash on the policies of our nation. And years later, in 2017, Drew gave his input on the technology to innovate the Texas ballot box. Today, they're going to join us to reflect on their talks, voting, citizenship, and the democratic institution. So please join me in welcoming Drew and Professor Lessig.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you so much for having me today.
Great to be here.
Thank you for joining us. So good afternoon, Professor Lessig and Drew. We're happy to have you here both today, and there's a lot to chat about. So why don't we go ahead and jump right in? I know that it's been several years since you joined us on our stage, and the ideas that you talked about back in 2010 are still incredibly relevant. So I want to be able to talk about what's taken place over the last several months and what has been the most revealing about our nation.
So should I launch into that, or?
Well, we wanted to talk, I think we first wanted to speak about what you believed was our representative democracy, unrepresentative democracy, and how you feel that is currently impacting our nation.
Right. So, I mean, when I think back on the talk in 2010, which I have a very strong memory of coming to San Antonio and giving that talk, what's striking to me about the difference between then and now is that then the issue was something that not many people were really focused on. And now practically everyone recognizes how broken this political system it is. And it's not just people on the left, it's people on the left and people on the right who realize that we have a political system which is so deeply unrepresentative that the consequence is that we get a government that just doesn't in any sense represent us. So in the book I just published last year, They Don't Represent Us, what I tried to do is to map the dimensions of this unrepresentativeness. So, the most obvious is the way we fund campaigns. We have a system where candidates spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money, and members of Congress, 30 to 70% of their time raising money. But they're raising money not from the average American, they're raising money from the tiniest fraction of the 1%, which means those people have enormous power in the system and the rest of America doesn't. Or think about gerrymandering, which is districts drawn for the purpose of giving some people power more than other people power. Or the way the Electoral College works to make states like California and Texas irrelevant to the presidential candidates, whereas states like Ohio and Pennsylvania become really the most important in the country. Or techniques to suppress the vote. These are all ways in which we've produced a representative democracy that's unrepresentative. And the hopeful thing I see is that now that people get this, now that people really understand this, I think there's a real shot that in the next couple of years, we could see significant reform to address these problems.
Yeah, Michelle, and I'll hop in as well. I can close my eyes and imagine me back on the red dot in San Antonio in 2017. And, when I think back to my talk and how I told a story of a student being disenfranchised on a college campus right here in San Antonio, I could essentially close my eyes today and tell several of those same stories, unfortunately. I think that there are things that have changed here in Texas, and that's because of grassroots, organizations and activists that have pushed counties to take those steps. Things like changing poll worker pay from $9 an hour in most of the major cities to up to $17 an hour in Bexar County and Harris County. Things like expanding polling locations on college campuses has happened, pretty greatly across the state. And then, youth engagement has, tripled in Texas in 2018. So, just a year after my TED Talk, we saw this like surge of youth activism and youth involvement. But, like a lot of the same problems that I talked about in my TED Talk, just 3 years ago are still here, and in some ways, because of the pandemic, magnified. So I think one of the things that I talked about was, the fact that to get registered in Texas, you have to sign a piece of paper. And so I have to hand you a clipboard with a pen and tell you to get registered to vote that away. And we've done this type of voter registration for years and years and years now on college campuses and in high schools. But when the pandemic hit Texas in March, we had to completely reshift the way that we interacted with young people across the state. Laws that disenfranchised the gentleman that I talked about in my speech because I wasn't deputized in the county that he lived in. I couldn't register him to vote. Those laws are still on the books here in Texas, and they're being enforced at an even higher rate right now. As I mentioned back then, it's easier for me to get on a plane, fly to Denver, get off the plane, and begin registering voters in Denver than it is to go 2 counties over in Texas and register voters there. And so things like reciprocity, which is like, does certain counties recognize your ability to register voters versus others? There's 254 counties in Texas, and you have to get deputized in each one of them. To like the voter registration deadline, which is coming up this next Monday on October 5th. And so it's one of those things of like, those are still in place. Those are still making what should be our representative democracy unrepresentative right here in Texas.
I was going to ask for you, Professor Lessig, to maybe give us some enlighten us about how the media affects this idea of representative democracy and unrepresentative democracy, and how you feel it's affecting all of us in the nation.
Yeah, so I mean, the book that I published has a title which is ambiguous between they don't represent us as in the government doesn't represent us. But the other part, actually, I think the more interesting part and the more difficult part is that we don't represent us. And by that, I mean that the way we've allowed media to evolve, the kind of platform infrastructure of media, both cable television and the internet, has driven us into these tribal, polarized corners of existence. It's as if we live in different planets. And that's because the business model of these media support this polarized reality. I think I can share. Can we share a screen here for a second? I want to see if I can. Yeah. Okay. I don't. Do you guys see something on the screen?
No.
No. Okay. So that's not going to work. So I'll just have to tell you what I was going to show you. What's so striking about the way cable television has evolved over the past 20 years is that if you look And in the graph I was going to show you, I think of it as the most frightening graph in the history of American politics. If you look at the content of cable television stations, Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, circa 2000, there was not really much of a difference between them. You couldn't really tell from the content analysis which supported which party. But beginning around 2000, you start seeing these cable networks veer dramatically into different polar tribal camps. And that's because it's easier to sell ads to coherent, fractured tribe than it is to sell ads to all of America at once. So the point is, it pays to turn us into crazy tribal, polarized partisans. And the same thing for Facebook. Facebook feeds us ads, but in the process of feeding us ads, it wants us to behave in ways that reveal what we care about, what we think about, what we find interesting, what we find boring, so that they can use that data to better sell us ads. And it turns out that if they turn us into crazy right-wingers or crazy left-wingers, getting us really angry at the other side, practicing the politics of hate, they make the most money they possibly can. So the business model of Facebook is a business model that turns on us revealing information that enables them to make us into these kind of crazy, ignorant in a very technical sense. We just don't understand what's going on the other side. And I don't think this is just, one side, it's both sides. I mean, the point is, I'll admit I live in a relatively liberal bubble. The media I like to consume gives me what I want. And the view I get of the world is confirmed by that media. I've reached out to friends who support the president to have engaged conversations about how could you possibly support the president. And I've discovered in those conversations things that I just didn't even know, things that had been told to me in some way that when I look at it, it turns out it's exactly the opposite, or it's different, or it's shaded in a particular way. And that's not surprising given the way media has developed. And the terrifying thing is, can we really run a democracy that's got to address issues for the nation as a whole when we're approaching those issues, those questions, from these radically different partisan bubbles? We don't even see the same world. We don't see the same problems because we've been informed or instructed in a way that leads us to see the world in radically different ways. And that is an enormously difficult challenge for democracy. And in my view, a challenge which is really something brand new. We've never been at a time where we've had an ability to understand what we, the people, think through polling and all this sort of techniques for understanding our views. But when we, the people, had been so effectively partisanized, let's turn that into a word, partisanized, turned into these partisan tribes. And I don't know how democracy works when that's who, in fact, we are.
Do you think that there's an opportunity to increase ethical journalism?
Well, I mean, ethics is great, but business eats ethics every time. So if the business model of media is to polarize, you can have the decent reporter or the decent commentator pushing to the side of let's tell the truth, let's be fair and balanced, really. But over time, the market eats away at those tendencies, that desire. And so I don't think, I honestly don't think with the business models of media that we've got right now, we're going to escape it. Now, what that means is we got to think creatively about how do we create environments where people can encounter political information in a more reflective, slower, careful way. And things like TEDx, I think, are perfect examples of that, where people come, they listen to a wide range of views, they reflect on it. They're not being fed in Twitter-length bites exactly how they're supposed to think. So there are environments where I think we can do politics well. They just are not Facebook or Twitter or cable television news.
Obviously the business model of the media is what is contributing to having something like the big pandemic become a partisan issue. Or
oh my gosh, yeah, exactly right. If a year ago when I published this book, we were just on the cusp of the impeachment. If you had said to me, "So will we see partisan views on the impeachment?" I would have said, "Of course, absolutely." I mean, you're going to see Fox News tell one story and MSNBC tell another story, and the world's going to be divided. But if you had said to me, "Well, imagine we had a pandemic that was going to kill 250,000 Americans," would you believe that story would be rendered in a partisan way, so that we would have fights about whether we ought to be wearing masks or what the right way to deal with the science around a pandemic would be? I would have said no. I would have said there's a limit, and that a pandemic is the limit. But of course, I would have been wrong. I mean, it's just astonishing that we live at a time where we can't even come to an agreement on even simple things like whether masks should be worn, and the tragedy, the costs of that. If you compare our losses to a comparable country like Germany, per capita losses, it is astonishing how we failed in this. And I think we failed in part because we don't have an infrastructure for developing a common understanding, even about something which is at its root plain old facts and science. And that's exactly what the pandemic story is about.
Drew, can you tell us a little bit about how you've seen how youth has impacted voters and voting, especially in this state?
Yeah, I think the more that young people are getting involved in Texas, the more that, they're pushing all of us to sort of update some of these laws and systems. I think we saw that, in 2019 in the Texas legislature, young people really led the charge against Senate Bill 9, which was a voter disenfranchisement bill or voter suppression bill. But also they were leading the conversation on things like online voter registration and what would automatic voter registration look like. And so, I think that as we have seen youth voter turnout and youth engagement go up over the last several years, we are seeing them, young people show up in spaces like City Hall, like County Commissioner's Court, like the Texas legislature, but also out in the streets when it comes to, Black Lives Matter and, this summer's reckoning on race relations in the United States. Like young people led led those conversations, and it's now driving policy on the local level when it comes to, police budgeting, or whenever it comes to like, mental health, finance or budget reallocations. And so I think that young people in Texas, Texas is a very young state. 41% of the entire state is under the age of 30. It's one of the youngest states in the United States. And then also out of that 41%, 63% of that group are young people of color. So it's a very young, diverse state. And we're starting to see slowly but surely, politicians listening to young people, and young people speaking loud enough that politicians must listen to them.
So we have a question by someone who's actually listening, Tim Fielder. He wants to know if the bubbles themselves are driving the division, or are they response to it?
There's no one-way causation here. I saw an analysis of this a couple of weeks ago. I think that puts it really well. The point is that these platforms are trying to give you what you want. Just like fast food is trying to give you what you want. Like, we want to eat buffalo wings. They taste really great. Like, there's no doubt that like you get one, you want 10. It's just exactly what the human body wants.
Yeah.
But it turns out it's not good for you, right? And it's the same thing with this kind of evolving, bubbleized, polarized media. It's what in some sense we want. We want to feel that we are right. So, if you support the president, you want news that tells you you're right to support the president.
Mm-hmm.
If you oppose the president, You want 100 different reasons why it's right to oppose the president. And the point is that that's a completely understandable psychological reaction that comes from a media which basically allows you to tune reality to your desires. Now, before this media, we had to confront reality whether we liked it or not. Like you 3 television networks, you watched television, the news was on the same time on all networks. You had to watch the news. The news was going to cover stuff you liked or didn't like. It wasn't going to cover it for people on the right or for people on the left. It was just going to cover it in a kind of Walter Cronkite straight down the middle way. And that was discomforting to people. But the point is, citizenship requires confronting facts you just don't happen to like, because we've got to figure out how we address problems together, even though we're very different. There are conservatives and there are liberals, and they need to live together and have a good democracy that can work together. And if we don't even see the differences or confront things we don't want to see anymore, it's hard to see how that's going to be possible.
So essentially, yes, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just wanted to jump in there because, we do a lot of work on social media. And I think this is, the algorithms of social media act in just the way that Professor Lessig, just described, is that, whether it is on Twitter or Instagram or even TikTok now, young people and others, even Facebook for older folks, the algorithm is giving them exactly what they want to see, and it's creating this sort of like bubble around them where their belief systems, their identity, sort of their tribe and their people are all like being sort of reverberated into their listening chamber and everything. And so I think it's up to us to make sure that if we are consuming those types of media, that we're trying our best to like get outside of those bubbles.
So do you either of you see a solution or a way for us to not just consume the type of media that already sees our worldview or confirms our worldview, other than, what is the incentive for people to get out of the type of media they're already consuming and get a larger worldview?
Well, I actually think there's a nice analogy to food. So there's something called the slow food movement. And what the slow food movement says is, let's understand how the human body works, and then let's fit the way we consume food to what we know about the human body. So what we know is, if you cook your food and eat it with friends, you can't help but have healthy consumption of food, because the food you cook can't possibly compete with processed food. I'm not talking about taking a pizza and heating it up in the oven. I'm talking about actually cooking, whether it's pasta or whether it's, chicken or whatever it is. If you actually cook it directly, you can't make it as poisonous as the processed food companies can. You're just not that good. You don't have the chemicals, right? So the point is, the food you will eat will be healthy food. And if you eat it slowly, your body can process it in a way that it'll be a healthy food experience. And we just work back from the human body to figure out where and how we should eat food. There's a slow democracy movement that's doing the same thing with information and democracy. It's saying, what are the contexts in which we're actually pretty good at coming to understand complicated, conflicting stories and facts, and sort them out in a way that helps us understand what we should be doing? It's not like we're bad at it in every context. We're good at it in lots of contexts. Like a jury sits there and is given information from both sides, then has to deliberate together, confronting people they don't agree with, and then come to a resolution. That's an environment, given the nature of humans, that actually is pretty good at resolving complicated issues in an effective way. Podcasts are like these narrative stories where people listen to them for an hour or 2 hours. I was on the Joe Rogan podcast, and I looked up, and we were 2.5 hours into the podcast, and it was like, this is incredible. Like, how is it possible? And he said, everybody listens to the podcasts all the way to the end. But the point is, if you've got, an hour long of back and forth with somebody talking about an issue, humans can process that well. What humans can't process well are the kind of scream matches on Twitter, or the kind of headlines on Facebook, tweaked to kind of drive us furious, make us into these kind of partisan trolls. And so what I think we need to think about is, how do we channel our democracy conversations into places we can do it well? I mean, the government can't do that for us, because the First Amendment's going to limit the government's ability to regulate content on Facebook or Twitter. So I'm not saying we regulate it like that. I think just like healthy eating requires people to take responsibility for what they put into their mouth and how they do it, healthy democracy is about people taking responsibility for how they expose themselves to this information, realizing how the world is in a certain sense against them, how all the money in the world is against them coming to understand things in a balanced or informed way. And just fighting against that by turning to the channels and the context that can actually do something effective for you.
Drew, do you see any solutions for the types of things here in the state of Texas that you mentioned for voter suppression?
Yeah, there's a lot of innovations that can be implemented here in Texas. Most of them will have to be implemented at the legislature, but some can. Texas gives a lot of power to the county commissioners and the county court or the county level, and so there's a lot of things that can happen right now, like today. With voting at the county level in Texas that will, can help expand access. So for instance, we could add more polling locations, throughout underserved communities of color. We could add more polling locations on college campuses, because we know that young voters are often first, second, third time voters, and they're learning the process. And so we've got to put polling locations there consistently in order to get them to show up regularly. Other things that we could do at the county level is, obviously Harris County is like leading the way, which is Houston, leading the way on things like vote by mail, and making sure that everybody has access to that, as much as legally possible, but also informing them of their rights to vote by mail per the Texas Supreme Court decision, and then again we can expand poll workers, we can expand these things that make voting, especially right now, as safe as possible. When it comes to some of the legal changes, obviously online voter registration would be an absolute game changer for democracy inside Texas. The wet signature requirement on top of the volunteer voter deputy registrar system is ultra convoluted and just hinders us from registering more people and getting them to recognize that they can vote in elections. Voter ID is another thing that needs to be addressed in the state. In 2013 we set up one of the most strict voter ID laws in the entire United States. You can vote with your concealed gun handgun permit, but you can't vote with your student ID in the state. It's things like that we can change that and expand those options so that more people can use that as a way to vote. And then also I think that we're seeing felony disenfranchisement pop up all across the United States, especially in Florida, as a way that if you have convicted of a crime, served your time, and then you should be able to vote again. It's one of those things of in Texas, you have to be what they call completely off paper, which is paid all your fines, everything, before you can register to vote again. And so there's a lot of folks that have felony convictions that don't even know that they can vote in Texas. And so doing things like voter registration in some of the jails and that kind of stuff will help alleviate that. And a lot of that work is already happening as well.
I wanted to ask you, Professor Lessig, what you think about the Electoral College, and if you actually believe that we are moving towards possibly getting rid of it, and what needs to change constitutionally and legally for something like that to actually take place.
Well, I mean, obviously there was a big debate triggered in the 2020 presidential primary where a lot of Democrats were calling for the abolition of the Electoral College. And my own personal view is that would be my first choice, to have national popular vote. But I actually don't think that there's the political support for moving to national popular vote. I think there's a perception, and I'm not sure it's real, but I think there's a strong perception that if we did that, it would favor large cities, the coasts. It would ignore the flyover states. So I actually think that there's another way to think about electoral college reform that would get us, 95% of what national popular vote would get us, but more consistent with the tradition of American federalism. And that is to say that we would have states allocate their electors proportionally at a fractional level. So if you got 48% of the vote in a certain state, you got 48% of the electors in that state. And the thing that would do overnight is that it would change the system we have right now, where the presidential candidates care about 6 or 7, maybe 8 or 9 states, the swing states. And they focus all of their energy on those states, into a system where they cared about a vote from everywhere. They would care about a vote from Texas as much as a vote from Kentucky, as Utah, California, New York. Right now, those states don't matter to the election of the president. And what we know from looking at how presidents spend money, or administrations spend money and regulate, the states that are swing states benefit relative to the rest of the country. So Texas is harmed. And it's not just that Democrats are harmed in Texas, Republicans are harmed in Texas. And just like it's not just Republicans that are harmed in California, it's Democrats who are harmed in California, because those states don't matter. But we could change that immediately within the system of the Electoral College, just by requiring we allocate votes proportionally at a fractional level. Now, that probably requires constitutional change. But when you think about how many states benefit from the current system and how many states are harmed by the current system, there's more than 3/4 of the states that are harmed by the current system. So an amendment takes 3/4 of the states to ratify. I think if we just get people to recognize that the real problem here is a system that elects our president by asking 10 swing states to pick the president, that's the real problem, that we could begin to think about reform that would solve that problem without necessarily jumping into the single national popular vote solution.
Thank you for answering that for us. Drew, we have a question about some voters along the border that, irrespective of how they're going to vote, getting them to the polls. How do you feel that we can improve the voting along the border so that those people have access to the polls and they can actually cast their vote?
Yeah, that's a great question. We get this question all the time, especially around young people, because we hear the myth that young people don't vote and that kind of thing. And it really is a perpetuating cycle. And so whether it is young people or Latinx folks or that kind of thing, ultimately, if nobody talks to the voter's not going to get engaged, and therefore will not vote, and then will not show back up on a campaign's radar or anything like that. And so it's this perpetuating cycle where the voter doesn't cast a ballot, so therefore they're not in the voter file or on anybody's target list. And so therefore nobody talks to them. They don't vote in another election, and it's a perpetuating cycle. So I think when it comes to engaging Texans, but especially Latinos, Latinx folks, you've got to, we've got to talk to them. It's groups' responsibility, it's campaigns' responsibility to go have conversations with them. There was a statistic in July 2020, 73% of Latinx young people across the United States polled had not heard from either campaign, which is a travesty. It is, it's one of those things of we can't say that young people aren't going to vote, especially in a state that's like Texas, if we aren't, making investments in them, if we aren't showing up and having conversations with them. And we know that new voters, especially young voters, are issue-based voters. They might not be completely party aligned yet. They're still filling out the system. So they want to have conversations about problems and solutions versus sort of party ideology. And so we see that show up in conversation around healthcare and climate change and, immigration and voting rights. And so these are deeper conversations that need to happen with people that are new in their civic life and their civic journey, and that has to be invested in. And that's the work that my organization that I work with does, and other organizations across the United States do, is have those deeper conversations with young people to build their sort of their civic knowledge, and then also get them involved in existing movements, and then ultimately voting down the way. So that would be my recommendation: is we've got to talk to them and we've got to get them engaged.
Do you think that there is any lack of infrastructure or the number of polling sites along the border? Is it less than the rest of the state? Is that might be impeding them from casting their vote?
Possibly, it's one of those things of like, we do know that, voter suppression throughout Texas is as common as barbecue. And so it happens everywhere. But the thing of it is that, when you look at it, like going back to Professor Lessig's point about like gerrymandering, we have some districts in Texas 23. I live here in San Antonio. Texas 23 runs from San Antonio all the way to El Paso. That is nearly 12 hours away from us right now. So that district is giant. Meanwhile, there's another congressional district that runs from South San Antonio all the way down to the border in Laredo. Mm-hmm. And so when things like gerrymandering come up, and we have these, weirdly drawn districts that allow politicians in a lot of ways to pick their voters versus voters not picking their politicians. Okay. What happens is it shares this, or it sort of spreads this idea of my vote doesn't matter. That's the number one reason young Texans do not vote, is my vote doesn't matter. Number two is voting is too difficult. And so it's one of those things that if they believe that their vote doesn't matter, you've essentially disenfranchised that voter for cycle after cycle after cycle, versus the idea of them building a habit. Voting is a habit. So if we can get somebody to show up in a presidential election, in a local election, and a midterm election, they're very highly likely, 75% plus, likely to vote in the next 3 elections almost automatically. And so we have to build that habit, and it's a teaching moment and everything, but voter suppression and gerrymandering and things like that reinforce this idea of my vote doesn't matter, when we know elections are won by 3, 5, 15 votes, so a classroom at San Antonio College can have a massive impact on a local election or a countywide election.
Yeah, I want to build on that. I think it's a really important point. Because we're often focused on voter suppression and people who are denied the right to vote. And of course, from my perspective, that's outrageous. And I can't believe a system would allow that, a democracy would allow that. But it's orders of magnitude more people who choose not to vote than who are denied the right to vote. And that problem is also outrageous. And it's a problem not because people are ignorant, it's because they're actually clued into the fact that they just don't matter, that the system is built to make it so they don't matter. And so that rather than like scolding people and saying, you ought to be voting, what we ought to be doing is building a system where they have a reason to want to vote and make it easy for them to vote. And then also, of course, vigorously enforce the right to vote by punishing people who interfere with that right. If I told you that state officials were systematically interfering with the Second Amendment right, we'd have a revolution. Well, why isn't there a revolution when state officials systematically interfere with the right to vote? Because if anything is fundamental to a democracy, from my perspective, that's more fundamental. I know some people might think it's equally as fundamental, but the point is it's on the same level and it ought to be just as important.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I completely agree with that. I mean, I think it's one of those things of like when you look at the numbers in Texas, Texas is not a red state or a blue state. Texas is a non-voting state. The majority of Texans do not cast a ballot. When you look, especially at the hyper-local level, at local government, which often touches your life more often than the federal government does or would. San Antonio, in our 2019 city election, and this was a massive improvement over previous years, reached 16% voter turnout for the city election, for the mayor and for city council. And so, in other cities, there's some cities that are slightly above that, but there's some cities that are lower than that. I think that Dallas, it was in the 6 to 10% range their past election in 2019. And so it's one of those things of like, I completely agree with Professor Lessig, is that we've got to explain to people why their vote matters and give them the reasons and then the mechanisms to go show up.
So we're going to go and move into the discussion involving how the pandemic has forced us into digital spaces, and how you feel about the future of democracy, given the fact that we are moving towards more of this digital age of having to vote electronically, and how you feel about how the whole pandemic has affected democracy itself.
Well, I'm happy to start with that. I mean, none of it is good. There's, I think certain fortunate people see a silver lining to the pandemic. If you've kept your job and you have your family at home and you don't have to travel as much, the pandemic feels like, it's been not so bad, especially if you've not been affected directly by the disease. But many, many people have been, harmed significantly. They don't have jobs. They don't have health care. They have no place to take care of their kids. Their kids aren't in school. It's devastating. And I think that's the same dynamic with democracy. In one sense, we have an opportunity to be more engaged because we have, incredible infrastructure to connect us. But if the platforms are tuned to tuning us into our own channel and keeping us committed to our own channel, it produces the kind of polarized understanding of even a question of science, not science in the next 20 years, not climate change, but science that's affecting, your neighbor right now. And I think that we've not really reckoned how to get over that problem. So we've talked about that a little bit. The one I'd add to is, it's really astonishing to recognize how insecure our digital infrastructure is. And that insecurity comes because we have been so lax in enforcing regulations, just criminal regulations against people who would do bad things using technology. The astonishing idea that we spend billions of dollars on tanks, but we don't spend billions and billions of dollars on tracking down hackers who are making our infrastructure so weak and vulnerable and attacking people who are vulnerable themselves, is to me kind of astonishing. And in the context of digital voting, or like using the infrastructure for democracy, the reality is right now it's just not safe enough. The idea that you would have electronic voting right now in the context of the internet is just not advised. And I think every expert who looks at this says, we know how to do it safely. You have techniques where there are paper trails, and you always have an audit trail that you can match up to the actual reckoning of the voting. And that's what we're going to have to rely on until we get an infrastructure for the network, which we can feel confident about, and we feel that is not the Wild West with roaming hackers and guns.
Drew, how do you feel that the digital age has impacted voting here in Texas?
Yeah, in some ways, I think that the digital age has, we haven't caught up yet. We still register voters on paper and with blue or black pen, and I think that that's something I highlighted back in my TED talk. But as I mentioned in my introduction, is that COVID-19 showed us that there were not just like cracks in the democracy in Texas, but they're actually like fissures, where, things like the voter registration programs are like amplified because there's no way to get in front of people. So we in like the summer, instead of registering voters in person, we had to shift the tactics that we in order to engage young people for this election. We had to mail out nearly 400,000 voter registration applications by mail that arrived in their mailbox, and then we had organizers call them or send them text messages for them to fill it out, and then they would put it into a postage paid envelope that had a barcode tracker to it, which we could then track to from their mailbox to the county elections office. So there is parts of technology that are catching up, which is something like that. Now in most major counties in Texas, you can track your mail-in, your vote by mail ballot. Bexar County and I believe Harris County just launched their tools yesterday. And so you can go online whenever you mail your vote by mail ballot in and just check on the status of it. One of the other things that we had to do because of the pandemic is create digital spaces for young people to show up. When we were all quarantining at home, young people were displaced off of their college campuses back to their apartments or back to their parents' home or that kind of thing. And so like we had to create digital spaces to connect with them, which is, a way for us to not only talk about the issues that matter to them here in Texas and keep them engaged and potentially get them registered to vote or have them pledge to vote, but also as a way for us to listen of like what was most important to them, and what we heard was, housing became a major issue. If you were being displaced off your dorm, you had to figure out a place to go live. Or if you were stuck in your apartment lease for 4 months and you couldn't leave, even though you have no income and that kind of thing, housing became a major issue for young people in Texas and still is. And then, I just think overall the digital infrastructure in Texas needs to be upgraded. We were plaintiffs in a case called Stringer 2, where we sued the Secretary of State over the fact that when you go to the DMV in Texas and get your driver's license, you can check a box and they will register you to vote, which is in compliance of the national, federal Motor Voter Act. But if you go online and renew your driver's license or, get an ID card, it does not, it says, do you want to register to vote? And when you check the box, a little box in the corner would pop up with a form for you to print off and mail in and sign. We said that violates the Motor Voter Act, sued in federal court and won. And the state actually implemented the very first version of online voter registration in the state about a week ago to comply with that court order. So now when you go, renew your driver's license online, you can digitally register to vote there. But, that's just like a baby step for what we need in online voter registration. We know that the state can build an online voter registration and it's time for them to build one. But if you look even up to other states like Colorado and Oregon, their automatic voter registration systems that's the Lamborghini of voter registration. And, which you move into the state, interact with any state office or county office, it automatically recognizes that you're new there. It registers you to vote automatically. It sends you a postcard in the mail that says, if you don't want to get registered to vote, then you can check this box and send it back, and they'll take you off the voter roll. That's completely like opt-out voter registration, which the systems that we have are opt-in. And so and then another digital space that is just really needs evolution is it's just the voting process in general. I think that like a lot of the voting machines, as I mentioned in my speech in 2017, are basically like Ataris with iPads strapped to them. Like they're very, very simple technology. As Professor Lessig mentioned, there are like hackathons where they will like go in and test, like how long does it take for a teenager to break into some of these machines and that kind of stuff. And our election system is decentralized enough to where widespread hacking is very difficult. But we should be investing money in these systems. We should be upgrading. Like we should be communicating across states and counties on how to upgrade these systems. And then, ultimately, I think that, the greatest access that we can have is, some sort of like blockchain system where you get a paper receipt for your ballot and that kind of thing, where you can potentially vote off your phone or off your home computer and everything's tracked and built into the blockchain like that. But, slowly but surely, we're taking baby steps there, but we really need investment. We need talent in the tech space to fight for these issues and implement them. And then we just need to make it happen legally and legislatively.
Thank you. I wanted to close this conversation with asking both of you, I know that you've just mentioned the things that we need to do digitally to secure our elections, but how you feel this path towards having a more representative democracy, how you feel we can make changes, or any comments that you want to make about this discussion and this particular topic. And I guess, Professor Lessig, you can go first and let us know how you feel hopeful about this whole process.
Well, I mean, I guess the thing that makes me feel hopeful is that when we see movements that try to appeal to people as citizens first, not as Democrats first or as Republicans first, but as citizens first, it tends to unleash extraordinary energy, because people actually want to be able to do politics where it doesn't involve tearing down their neighbor, but instead involves building up a better democracy. So, in Michigan, a woman named Katie Fahey, a 20-something year old named Katie Fahey, after the 2016 election, did a Facebook post where she said, who wants to help me, fix partisan gerrymandering in Michigan? And within a couple months, they had 4,000 volunteers who collected hundreds of thousands of signatures in every single county in the state. That then led to a ballot measure that had more than $20 million raised and spent to sort of convince the state to follow that, and then was ultimately successful. And one of the principles that Katie had at the core of her campaign was that nobody was allowed to say, this is going to help the Democrats or this is going to help the Republicans. They were not allowed to think about this from the perspective of party. They had to think about this from the perspective of democracy. And it was such a liberating moment, because we live politics so uniformly from a political perspective, and we don't even notice how absurd it is. I mean, you watch what happens in Washington, and you watch the way our representatives contort themselves to justify every inconsistency, when you know that the only thing that's explaining what they're doing is, does it favor your party or does it hurt your party? Washington, as a great father, was fearful of a lot of things about his children. But the thing he was fearful most about his child, the United States, was that partisan politics would take over our democracy. And he thought that would be fatal. Well, it's taken a couple hundred years, but I fear he was right. I fear that our ability to bend reality, to conform it to our party platform, is the most dangerous reality of modern politics. And so I think we need to feed these movements that can step above it and look at each other and say, you're a liberal and I think you're nuts, but you're an American and I want to work with you to build a better America, and vice versa. And if we can't do that, then I fear that this great republic is lost.
Thank you. Drew, I'm going to ask you the same question, but I also want you to talk to us about how getting the youth involved has impacted your view on the solutions going forward for our democracy and our nation.
Yeah, I absolutely think that working with young people has renewed and refreshed my hope, over the last several years. Because I have seen, I have Facebook, I have Twitter, I have Instagram. I see the just constant clashing of partisanship in those spaces. But we work, my organization works often with young people who are new voters, and who are open to listening, to learning, to having conversations, to deep listening exercises, and that are interested in these issues that matter and the solutions that come along with them, versus identifying as a sole part of a political party or political movement. So I think that, first of all, young people in Texas are giving me a lot of hope. They're getting involved. They're leading spaces. You're seeing more youth-led organizations pop up every single year. And they're engaging other young people, which is the way that young people want to be engaged. They want to talk to their peers. The second thing that gives me some hope in Texas is voting rights advocates. I think we as a group of orgs, there is a cadre of folks that are fighting for voting rights work every single week here in Texas. We saw mail-in drop-off ballot boxes pulled yesterday via proclamation. And Harris County has 4.7 million people in that county. There's more people that live in that county than 25 other states. And now they are down to one drop-off ballot in downtown ballot box in downtown Houston. And so, whether it is, civic groups or advocates or lawyers, there is the pushback on these just blatant voter suppression tactics in Texas, as Professor Lessig says, holding folks accountable. And that gives me some hope as well. And then the final thing that gives me hope, I think, is the future of democracy, even though right now, I agree with Professor Lessig. If we don't get it together, the Republic could be in danger. I have a lot of hope that I think young people and that the next generation, Gen Z, is going to come forward and completely reimagine in some ways our American democracy, and hopefully imagine the way that participation looks like, imagine the way that civil discourse looks like, and reimagine the way that they want to be governed as a people here in our great republic. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. I want to thank both of you for joining us. It's been a great conversation, and I know that both of you have done so much to advance this democratic nation, but mostly I just think that your comments and your experience in this is just brought a lot of light to things that we need to change, and things that we can be hopeful for. And I'm just really grateful that both of you made time for us today to join us.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.